So, welcome everybody to our second land care lunch break for this summer. Today, we're really excited to have Andrew Tufts of Maine Audubon joining us to talk about choosing the right native plant for your yard. Um, and I will hand it over to Andrew. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks, Brenda. It's a pleasure to be here. My name is Andrew Tufts. I'm the program manager at Maine Audubon's Bringing Nature Home program. And today I'm going to be talking to everyone about using the right plant in the right place, picking the right plant for your yard, which is an age-old saying in the gardening world, and it very much applies to native plantings as well. And before I get into that, I'm just going to tell you a bit about the Bring Nature Home program in Maine Audubon. So our Bring Nature Home program was started several years back, and its premise is focused on restoring and rebuilding Maine's natural biodiversity by utilizing native plants that support the widest array of wildlife. So I'll start by asking what is a native plant and why are they important? And really what it comes down to is a native plant is defined by its relationship to a place and its ecological function. So it's coevolutionary history with all of the other plants and animals in that are part of its community. Take, for example, milkweed, which we have a few different native species of milkweed here in Maine. Milkweed has co-evolved with a number of different plants in Maine over thousands of years, and there's a variety of insects that depend on it, specifically the monarch caterpillar. It has developed the ability to eat milkweed and digest its toxic milky substance you see here in this image, and which most other creatures cannot. And that toxicity actually makes it less palatable to a lot of would-be predators. And so you see this kind of ecological functional relationship between the insect and the native plant. And this is really at the core of what makes a native plant native to Maine. And so if you're thinking about wanting to have as many native plants as possible to support as much wildlife as possible, a great place to start is focusing in on certain species that have an outsized role of function in the landscape in Maine. And we call those keystone species. So think back to a Roman arch, and the keystone is that stone up in the top middle of the arch. And if you remove it, the whole arch falls apart. And that's very similar to these plants. Whereas if you removed certain plants from our ecosystems, the ecosystems would potentially fall apart because of just how much wildlife they support. And take, for example, this is a red oak tree, which is a very common tree in southern central Maine. And it hosts over 434 types of caterpillar species. I'd mentioned that milkweed is the host plant to monarch caterpillars. Well, milkweed supports many insects and is also a keystone species, but the oak tree is by far the most prolific keystone species we have in Maine. So if you wanted to plant one thing that could support the widest array of wildlife in your backyard in Maine, it would be an oak tree. And so I just want to give one study as an example of just how much native plants matter, particularly in the places where we live. And there was a study done in 2018 on the Carolina chickadee that looked at how many native plants are required in a developed area to support a nesting pair of chickadees. And what it found is that when there's a nesting pair of chickadees, they will not leave a 2-acre area. And that's because they're feeding their nestlings 400 to 700 caterpillars per day, which amounts to 5 to 10,000 caterpillars over 2 weeks. That's the period of time those nestlings are in the nest. It's an extraordinarily number of caterpillars. And you can see why they wouldn't want to leave a 2-acre area, or they could not leave a 2-acre area because they're making so many trips back and forth to the nest to feed those nestlings. And so from that, what they found is that chickadee populations are not sustainable when native plant biomass falls below 70% in a 2-acre area. So think of a lot of our more developed landscapes that are covered in one of the biggest offenders, which is grass or lawn. And if it's just covered in lawn and speckled with a few non-native trees here and there, roads, parking lots, etc., you are not going to have breeding chickadees or most other songbirds. Chickadees are used as an example here, but the vast majority of native songbirds are also dependent on insects, specifically caterpillars, to feed their young. Over 90% of songbirds require caterpillars to feed their young. So, with this background information in mind of why native plants are so important, you think if now we're going to talk about where to start. If you want to bring native plants into your landscape, what are you going to look to for inspiration? And the best thing about native plants is you can just look right outside. Here in Maine, we have so many wonderful natural plant communities that are still relatively intact. And a great resource to start is the Maine Natural Areas Program. And this is a state website, a state organization that has these wonderful natural community fact sheets. And as I mentioned earlier, native plant is really defined by its coevolutionary history within a certain community. And so, take, for example, a dune grassland. You'll find this along much of the southern coast, southern mid coast of Maine. And there are a variety of plants that are found naturally growing together. And that includes things like little blue stem, beach plum is the plant in the upper right corner, dune grass, etc. Some other natural plant communities would include rose maritime shrubland. This is shrubs that include bayberry, Virginia rose, blueberry, asters. Um, Many of these plants actually you will now find planted along the new Back Cove project in Portland, Maine, that's just been going in. So as far as a place to look for inspiration, many of the native straight species plants that are being planted at Back Cove are similar to this plant community. Another one would be a pitch pine dune woodland, and I will be showing some pictures later on that show how you could replicate this in certain more developed settings. And then just one more example would be a northern hardwood forest, and looking to the various more shade understory type plants that do well in this kind of setting. So now that we've talked about some of our natural plant communities that exist, and I encourage everyone to go check that website out and look through all the different natural plant communities. There are many, many, many that have been documented and that have profiles like that and are wonderful inspiration. That said, most of the places where we live, well, especially in Portland, are no longer ecologically intact as they historically once were. So what many folks will be doing if they are integrating native plants into their landscape, that you should not have the goal of completely rebuilding that historical natural plant community that was once intact, but rather you're going to be working towards something much more novel, a novel plant community that draws inspiration from those historical natural plant communities. So I'm just going to start with a few typologies for gardens, starting with moist woodlands or shade gardens. And most of these photos were taken in a garden on Munjoy Hill. And I'll reference this property a few different times. And because there are a variety of different plant communities and typologies that this landscape has used on their property. Because on one single property, a very, very small property, in fact, there are tons of different microclimates that occur that where you can create these little novel ecosystems inspired by natural plant communities. So this is one section of the property that's a little more northern exposure, less sun exposure, so more moisture is caught here. And they've integrated plants that are shade loving and also do well with some more moisture. Ranging from on the left, you see some trillium, pitcher plants, sedges, some wild strawberry in the background. And then in the middle, that's striped maple, which is something you typically see in a more deciduous understory. Dutchman breeches on the right, as well as a variety of ground covers. I often have heard over time that sometimes folks think shade gardens don't have the ability to produce much interest or aesthetic interest or color. And I think that couldn't be further from the truth. There's so many lovely woodland understory plantings and plants that we have in Maine, ranging from this is wild geranium mixed in with some tiarella and Christmas fern. And so while the flowers themselves bring a lot of color, there's also just a ton of variation in the shades of green that we have. And this is a separate property, but this is over on the other side of the peninsula on the northern side of a building where you don't have as much sun exposure. So, and there's a fairly established street tree canopy. So you'll see a variety of shade-loving plants such as Canada anemone, hay-scented fern. There's some northern spice bush on the left. All natives and thriving in this streetscape environment. I'll reference hell strips, that is the space between sidewalks and the street, a few different times throughout this presentation because it's a very underutilized landscape in more developed environments. Typically anywhere where there are sidewalks. Oftentimes it's just grass, which is fundamentally dead space. Additionally, as we try to increase the health of our urban canopy and of our street trees, one of the best things we can do is to provide what is termed these days a soft landing. So if we plant an oak tree and we are hoping that lots of moths and butterflies and different caterpillars take refuge in that tree, um, the vast majority of caterpillars, when they pupate and go into their cocoons, oftentimes we think of caterpillars in their nests up in the trees, but I think over 90% of caterpillars actually will drop down to the ground and nest in the leaf litter down below. So if it's all grass underneath this keystone species of an oak tree that you've planted, then you're kind of creating an ecological trap where these insects come in, but they actually don't have the proper ground environment to nest. So doing something like this, where you plant these native ground covers, is a great way to create a quote soft landing for our insects to overwinter. And this is just a few of the plants that I mentioned and we were just looking at. And if you want a little bit more inspiration, I've got a few different gardens throughout this presentation that are outside of Portland. This is McLaughlin Gardens out in South Paris, which is about a 45-minute drive west of Portland, northwest. And it's a really lovely woodland shade garden that is a beautiful day trip. And I encourage folks to take a look. Okay, so moving on, dry, sunny sites or meadows. And these are some of the landscapes that meadows, especially in Maine, uh, are quite popular. Especially they tend to have a lot of color, a lot of pop in the summer anyways. But they can be pretty complicated too. And then some of the dry, sunny sites going to be talking about are sunny and dry to the point of being what could be thought of as a constraint. But I often like to think of constraints as opportunities in a landscaping sense. And going back to those little in-between spaces or hell strips, in between driveways, sidewalks, pathways, etc. This is going back to that same property on Munjoy Hill in the East End, where they have on one side where they had more shade, they did that woodland community. This is a full sun environment that's very sandy and what would often be thought of as very harsh conditions for anything to grow. And they have replicated one of those coastal natural plant communities I referenced before. This could be somewhere between the Rose Maritime shrubland or a pitch pine dunescape. That's a pitch pine you see in the center, flanked by bur oaks, and then it has ground covers of bearberry with sedges, asters, goldenrods. They even put some lichen in there. So every square inch is filled, and that's another thing to think about when trying to create an ecological landscape. You really don't want to have gaps. So a lot of traditional gardens have used mulch as a way of suppressing weeds and to keep things the same. The point of an ecological landscape is to really fill all the spaces, fill all the ecological niches, and to then let it change over time. Going back across town, there's going to be a lot of flip-flopping from one side of the peninsula to the other in this presentation. This is largely due to a lot of walking I've done. I have a 20-month-old, and we've done a lot of stroller walks over the past couple of years, which you might see featured in a couple photos. This is another very sunny site out in what otherwise would have just been dead space, probably lawn or grass that was mowed every once in a while by the city. And instead of that kind of coastal dunescape, they've taken a more designed approach that is certainly a novel plant community. And it integrates a whole variety of both meadow species, sand barren type species like butterfly milkweed. That's the orange flower you see here. It's really gorgeous when it's in full bloom. There are very few other plants that have quite such a profuse orange blossom here in Maine. And it thrives in super well drained, sandy, acidic, and actually low nutrient sites. So a lot of our developed landscapes, when we developed a landscape, we put in a lot of sand and gravel with the intent of making it as well drained as possible. And and for traditional gardening or gardening, that is not uh, the ideal soil condition. But for many, many, many of our native plants in Maine, it is absolutely the ideal condition. So rather than have to go in and amend with compost, you can really work with what's there. And I'm sure this landscape probably utilized some compost. This looks like a pretty robust planting, but um, still, it takes advantage of that dry, sunny condition. This is just another perspective. You can see some pale purple cone flowers, a variety of native grasses. There's the white flower sprinkled throughout is penstemon or foxglove beard tongue. And then there's Joe Pyeweed tucked against the building, which is in a more probably it gets more moisture back there. So again, talking about microclimates, even within one relatively small area, there are a lot of different things happening with sunlight, moisture, etc. This is just later on in the season, or perhaps earlier in the season, before the butterfly weed was in bloom. There's that stroller I mentioned, might make a surprise appearance. And moving on from that site, so still talking about kind of these hell strips, these in-between spaces, which are typically thought of as very harsh environments to grow anything. This is actually up at the Coastal Maine Botanical Gardens in Booth Bay. And this is one of the newer sections of their facility, which I guess at this point isn't that new, but it's where all the huge parking lots were put in, and the vegetation has started to really come in quite successfully. And on the left, you see a whole long hedge of bush honeysuckle, and that's a fantastic plant for sunny sites, especially it's used for erosion control, and it's just a whole variety of things, great in mass, as you see here. Whereas on the right, there's this another hellstrip planting, which is more of a novel plant community here. And you can see a number of things that are um, that have been integrated into this planting. In the very foreground, you see kind of a silvery uh, evergreen type ground cover, and that's plantain leaf pussy toes, and it's gone to seed. All those seed heads you see in the foreground. That's a phenomenal plant, which I'll mention again later on for really dry, sunny sites. Behind it is a variety of Monarda, or native bee balm. To the left, there's a little showy goldenrod tucked in. Behind everything, there's some purple coneflower. So really a nice mix of plantings that thrive in this sunny condition um, and add a ton of interest to what otherwise would be an underutilized grassy landscape. All right, moving on from some of the more developed sunny landscapes, I just wanted to mention meadows because many folks love meadows in Maine, but it's also a good opportunity to talk about just how um, historically temporary a meadow would be in a landscape in Maine. Um, over 99% of the state of Maine in its natural condition would be closed canopy. So whether that's a hardwood forest or a pitch pine forest, etc. Um, Meadows are almost always the result of either a riparian opening for lakes, different types of waterways, or a sign of disturbance. So you have a patch of trees that come down in a hurricane, or there's a fire, etc. So a meadow is very much the first phase in succession. It's a temporary landscape that it's the first things that come up when exposed to new sunlight. And one of the most common plants we have in meadows are goldenrod, and this is actually Canada goldenrod. And this is at Gilson Farm, where I work in Falmouth, Maine. And oftentimes I'll get the question from folks who have a meadow, but most of what's in the meadow is goldenrod, because this is a very, very aggressive species. And it is very good at outcompeting many other herbaceous plants in this kind of setting. If you want to have more diversity in the landscape, there are things you can do, such as you can get rid of it by mulching for a year and then pulling the mulch back. You can solarize the landscape, and that's what we did here at Gilson. We did a few patches where we got rid of what was there, which included a variety of invasives, which I guess was spoken about at the last one of these. And once we killed back all the grass and the goldenrod, we reseeded it with a meadow mix. And one of the first things you'll see come in a meadow mix are the annuals or biennials, such as black-eyed Susan, which is the dominant yellow flower you see here. And then over the next few years, you'll watch that space grow and change as the long-term perennials start to come in, such as New England aster. And you can see there are two different patches here. In the foreground was planted a year or two prior before the other patch. And so in the distance, you can see that black-eyed Susan coming in, whereas this is a more mature patch where the asters are now thriving. This is just an example of some of the plants that do well in our more sunny conditions. Moving on to shrublands or hedgerows. So these are spaces whether you want to create a privacy hedge or you just want to create a more intact understory underneath an existing canopy. And that's what we did in collaboration with the City of Portland's Parks Department and the school district over at King Middle School in Deering Oaks. A lot of the oak trees had been experiencing a lot of hardship and stress over the past few decades due to the level of compaction because the majority of the park had just lawn underneath these oaks, talking about, the soft landing again and so what we did is we worked on building curriculum around restoring the natural understory that should exist under an oak forest. And so if you're ever in Deering Oaks over on the side near King Middle School, I encourage you to check it out. We have a variety of signage and QR codes there where you can learn about some of the plants that we've put in there. Just a few of the shrubs that encourage in these kinds of landscapes, ranging from chokeberry, pussy willow, lots of great native dogwoods, viburnums, blueberries. And then coastal landscapes. So this is over at in South Portland at Willard Beach. And we worked with the city of South Portland on restoring a patch of this landscape that had previously been filled with a combination of invasives and then rugosa rose, beach rose, which is thought by many for a long time what was native, but it indeed was brought over and has been here for a long time and really taken hold of a lot of our coastal environments. So that was removed, and what we put in was a variety of these coastal dunescape plantings inspired by those natural communities I mentioned before, ranging from eastern red cedar, pitch pine, beach plum, dune grass, and then on the right is a mix of dune grass with seaside goldenrod, which is a salt-tolerant species of goldenrod. And that's something to mention about all of these species here, because they have evolved in these coastal landscapes, they all would have quite a bit of salt tolerance, which is why they make such a great planting for a lot of our sidewalk or landscapes that are adjacent to sidewalks that can be salted in the winter. And here are a few of those plants, ranging from the bayberry to the beach plum. And I just wanted to mention rain gardens or swales. So this is down in East Bayside or the Bayside neighborhood of Portland, some green infrastructure that was put down there with a variety of plants such as switchgrass, Joe Pye weed, blue flag iris. A lot of these plants are plants that can do really well in a lot of water, but then they also have to be able to handle prolonged periods of really dry conditions too. That's the reality of a lot of our of rain garden conditions is that it's not always raining. Take yesterday, for example. That's a day where beds would have very little water, and plants have to be able to survive in those. So rain gardens and swales are a wonderful feature. It's especially in this day and age, you really want to focus on keeping as much water that hits your property on your property. You want to slow the flow to help keep our waterways and things like Casco Bay clean. And here, just a few examples of our wetland or waterway natives from swamp milkweed, mentioned the iris, cardinal flower, Joe Pye weed, um, winterberry, sweet gale. And then additionally, small spaces. So in Portland and other more urbanized landscapes, oftentimes folks don't have maybe don't have a yard at all. Where I live, I don't we only have space for a tiny little planting area. And a great solution for that kind of space are pots. And many native plants can grow really well in pots. Um, these were these are pictures from a West End property, and there was an article written about native plant container gardening by Heather McCargo. Who was the founder of Wild Seed Project. Many of those pictures were of her landscape, and so I encourage you all to check that out. It's at their website, wildseedproject.net. It's all about how you can really make a difference with just putting a native plant in a pot, regardless of if you just have a tiny little stoop. I wanted to mention slopes. So my daughter's making another appearance here. This is over at Fort Williams Park in Cape Elizabeth, and they've in the past several years put in an incredible children's garden and a meadowscape up on top of this hill you see there. But one thing I wanted to feature was the slope here, and slopes are a really important space to make sure that we vegetate to prevent erosion. And two of the species shown here, one was shown before. I mentioned that bush honeysuckle, deer villa. That's on the left photo in the foreground. And then behind it, up above in the photo on the right, the really taller plant is flowering raspberry, which is a gorgeous shrub with a beautiful pink and yellow flower. It's not as prized for the fruit itself, but rather the flowers. And there's one more landscape typology I wanted to mention. This is going back across town again to that East End property where, as I mentioned, every square inch of the property has been filled with native plants, including the driveway itself. And there are a variety of plants that, if you want to create a pathway that can hold up to foot traffic, there are certain plants that do better than others. And that includes things like wild strawberry, certain types of sedges, path brush, as you might guess from the name. And then I'm showing the plantain leaf pussy toe again on the right as one that just can handle some of the most inhospitable, sunny, very minimal soil type environments. And so with that, I just wanted to run through a few resources. The first being iNaturalist. This is a fantastic tool where you can go and look up plants and wildlife and a variety of natural observations in the places where we live. So if you are new to an area and you want to figure out what have people identified around me already, it's a great place to figure that out. And then once you get into it, you can start logging your own entries as well. It's a fantastic citizen science initiative. And then as far as identifying plants for a digital plant key is Native Plant Trust's Go Botany. It shows you down to the county, whether it's native in Maine, which is a fantastic resource to have. And then our own native plant finder at Maine Audubon. So if you go to mainenativeplants.org, it takes you, you have a couple of options once you get there, and this is one of them, our native plant finder. And what's great about our plant finder is it has all these different search filters from bloom month, sun, shade conditions, soil, size, wildlife benefited, etc. So of all these different landscape typologies we've been talking about, these filters help you find that. It's just an example of some of the plants that are featured on our website. And then finally, if you're looking to purchase some of these plants, we do have a native plant sale that runs May through October. It's going right now. I've been looking outside at the nursery as I've been talking to you all. I think I saw a skipper butterfly land on some little blue stem, which is one of it's a host. And so our sale runs all through the season. We have pickups at our Gilson Farm location here in Falmouth. So take a look. It's shop.mainnativeplants.org. And with that, I just want to thank you all very much. Happy to take any questions if there are any. Otherwise, thanks again.
Thank you so much, Andrew. That was very helpful and very thorough. Yeah, people can raise their hands or just come off of mute if you have questions. Mm.
I just want to say I really appreciate that you gave us you reminded us of the plant sale because I think sometimes it's hard to find native plants sold at nurseries, and I know that many do, but yeah, I just know like even trying to buy like bulk seeds has kind of been an issue for us. But no, I thank you. This was a fantastic presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you
Robin,
so much.
hi.
Hi. I was wondering if you have recommendations for the best native plants, yeah, like for a container garden.
For a container garden. Um, so yeah, I think it again kind of comes down to like where the container is. So is it either is it on a sunny spot or a shady spot? That's where I'd start. If it's in a sunny spot, a variety of our grasses, little blue stem, wild strawberries, the pussy toes, as I'd mentioned before, asters, goldenrods. Aim for those keystone species too. Even just an oak sapling, an oak sapling you could keep alive for a number of years in a pot. And a tiny oak tree still will have a contribution to our environment. Maybe not as much as a mature tree, but it makes a difference. So I would say play around. There's a lot. It's amazing how many things will survive in a pot. The one caveat is you do have to water it. Unlike if these plants are in the ground, you have to water them to be established, but once they're established, you should never have to water them again. In a pot, you have to water it indefinitely. So, but most things will really grow in a pot with the right care in the right place. And if it's in a shady location, I think that shade plants potentially even grow better in pots.
Thank you.
Yeah.
That's good to know. I was also wondering that. And then I was also curious, I know in the past, like, my family's had some trouble getting plants started like in shady areas, and it was probably that we used the wrong plant. But I was curious, like, if that's something people are struggling with, like, what people can do, like, to help get those plants started.
Yeah. So it's really coming back. I mean, it's exactly what this whole presentation is about, is coming down to understanding the little microclimates of that site and knowing, are you is it relatively protected? Take for example an alternate leaf dogwood, also known as pagoda dogwood, does great, really well in shade. I've seen it do well in a variety of conditions, but it can also be somewhat finicky. It typically likes more protected areas so that it aren't when it's not exposed to a ton of wind. So even in a shady site, if it happens to be in a wind corridor, it might not do well. So there are lots of different climate conditions that have to be taken into consideration. Additionally, so soil, whether it's well drained or sandy, well-drained soil versus clay, that has a big impact on a plant's success. And then, and just generally, I would take, if some of the native ecology is intact, I would take cues and clues from the plants that are there, even just in the surrounding neighborhood. Get a sense of what historically might have been there and trying to draw inspiration from those communities.
Cool. Thank you. That's very helpful. Should we have any other questions from anybody?
I have a question. And maybe it was in one of these resources you shared, but like something that can identify currently, like the plants that are currently on my property. I just bought a house last year and there's some stuff growing. There's some bushes and shrubs, but I don't even know where to begin in terms of identifying them. Um, would one of
Yeah,
these resources you mentioned work for that?
Go Botany is pretty good at keying out existing plantings. I
Right.
would say our, our phone's ability, AI is getting really good at identifying at least the genus of the plant. I would not trust it that far beyond that, but at least it often can at least start you down the right path. It can show you things that are at least similar to it, and then Google is quite good these days at filtering out what it could be. Combined with GoBotany, it's a wonderful resource.
Awesome. Any other last questions people had? Well, cool. We will wrap things up then. Thank you everyone very much for being here. Andrew, thank you very much for your presentation. That was excellent. We have one more webinar in this series on Tuesday, July 8th. Again at noon, we'll talk about stream health, phosphorus, and eutrophication, and what we can do in our yards. So you'll get an email after this with the recording of the presentation. And if you have any more questions, let us know. Thank you all very much.
Thanks for having me.